Okay, brethren, for a couple of 3 weeks now, I've been looking at the topic of what you might call the divine council. You know, you can sometimes think that God runs the entire universe entirely on his own, but that's not what the Bible shows. The Bible discloses that God has what you might call a divine council. A bit like a king in ancient Babylon or Assyria, whatever. He wouldn't just operate on his own. He would have a council, a royal court, individuals, officials of various different sorts, his own sons, and of course the sons of a king typically are called princes. We've got them in this country today. You know, King Charles has two sons. They are princes. There's Prince William, Prince Harry. So the sons of a king are called princes. If you look at Saudi Arabia today, there are, I think, hundreds of thousands of princes. So typically, when you have a king, the top jobs in his administration go to his sons, the sons of the king, who are often referred to as princes. Although when we look at God or we think about God in heaven, we're probably all quite familiar with the concept of angels, who are ministering spirits, but the Bible shows that there are additional gods, or sons of God, or princes. Right? Sometimes that's a bit uncomfortable, but surely there's only one God. Well, there is the God, capital G, whose name is Jehovah, but the Bible reveals from various places there are other gods. You might think with a small g. Whereas the God is eternal, has always existed. The other gods are created beings. The God, Jehovah, is the Most High God. There's nobody above him. In fact, there's nobody near him. The other gods are spirit beings, but they are not anywhere like the true Jehovah God. Right? And one of the key passages we can look at, which reveals quite a bit of this, is in Psalms 82. If we turn there, Psalms 82, which we've been to the last couple of weeks, we'll reread verses 1 through 7. And here we read in verse 1, God, capital G, Jehovah God, stands in the congregation or the assembly of the mighty. He judges, evaluates, assesses among the gods, plural. So clearly there are gods. Otherwise that verse makes no sense. The God, Jehovah God, stands in the congregation, the assembly of the mighty ones. He judges among the gods, plural. There are a number of them. Right? And the ESV translation, the English Standard Version, translates this verse as, God has taken his place in the divine council, this royal court of various high-level spirit beings that provide support to God. And he could probably do it on his own, just like he could preach the gospel on his own. But God chooses to use human beings, pastors and teachers and evangelists and prophets and apostles and so on. And so God uses spirit beings to carry out his will in the universe. He could perhaps do it on his own, but why should he? He likes company. He's got spirit beings as company. He's got physical human beings as company in his family. So God judges among the gods. And what does he make of them? Well, not a lot, unfortunately. Verses 2 through 5. How long, says God, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? These God beings, as you'll see later, I think we started to look last week, have been put over the nations. They have subjects in their nations. These gods in those nations should be imitating the God, but they seem to be failing because they're corrupt. They're fairly useless, and God's not happy. Verse 3, defend, or you should defend the poor and fatherless. You should do justice to the afflicted and needy. You should deliver the poor and needy, free them from the hand of the wicked, those subjects of yours in your territories. They do not know, nor do they understand. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are unstable, all the basic principles. So what does God say? What's his conclusion when he looks at and judges the gods? Verse 6, I said, you are gods. That's true. That's a statement of truth. I said, you are gods. All of you are children of the Most High, or sons of God. But even so, even though you are gods and sons of the Most High, you shall die like men do and fall like one of the princes. So God's made his decision. He's judged them. They've utterly failed in their territories and nations to look after their subjects. God holds them accountable, and he says, even though you're gods, spirit beings, and could enjoy, in theory, immortality, you're going to die. I'm going to terminate you all. Which is quite, of course, perhaps a surprise to them. If they have immortality, it's conditional. God can pull the plug, and it looks like he's going to do that because of their failure. And I think we saw last week, and we'll see some more today, that these God beings, these sons of God, are associated pretty much with different nations, different territories physically. We can see a couple of nations mentioned if we turn to Daniel chapter 10. So we turn to Daniel, the prophet, chapter 10. I'm going to read verses 12 to 13. So an angel has come to visit Daniel. The angel, I suspect, is Gabriel, but I don't think there's a name actually mentioned explicitly, but it looks like Gabriel, at least to me. Then he, the angel, said to me, Daniel, do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard. And I have come because of your words. So God, the God, Jehovah God, sent this angel to bring a message to Daniel. You might have thought, well, the angel will arrive an hour later, depending on how far away heaven actually is. But no, the angel, Gabriel or whoever, was held back for 21 days. Let's continue. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. The prince is obviously not physical prince holding back an angel from God in heaven. It's a spirit being called here a prince. The Greek version of the Old Testament refers to him as an archon, A-R-C-H-O-N, probably a useful term to keep in mind, an archon, a prince, and of course a prince is the son of the king. That's what prince is, right? And a prince tends to rule over a principality in modern times, right? So here's a prince, clearly a powerful spirit being, powerful enough to hold back Gabriel or whichever angel it was for 21 days. I mean, God's angel can't get through to Daniel. How powerful is this spirit being? Well, by the sound of it, pretty powerful. And behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, chief archons, came to help me, for I'd been left alone there with the kings of Persia. So Michael, a chief prince, one of the chief princes, plural, comes to help Gabriel or whoever. And finally, with the help of another chief prince, the angel gets through to Daniel with the message. Now, Michael is referred to in the New Testament as an archangel, right? In, I think, 1 Thessalonians 4, and specifically for sure, Jude. Michael is an archangel, right? And it says here, Michael, one of the chief princes, plural. So that suggests there are several archangels, right? I don't know how many. If you're a Catholic, which you're probably not, but if you're a Catholic, you'll probably have 7 archangels. You know, Gabriel's an archangel in Catholicism, and so is Michael, of course, and Raphael, I think, and Uriel, and a few others perhaps, right? But there certainly are a number of archangels which appear to be particularly powerful spirit beings. And if he's a chief prince, then he's a son of the king, son of God. So an archangel is clearly a son of God, a prince. Or last week we saw the term watchers, if you remember, a week ago. So over Persia, which is a territory, a nation, there is a powerful spirit being, an archon or a prince or a son of God or a watcher. And verse 20, the same chapter, we read, Then the angel said, Do you know why I have come to you? And now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia, the archon of Persia. And when I have gone forth, indeed, the prince, archon of Greece will come. So over the nation or territory of Greece, there is a powerful spirit being, a prince, an archon. A prince is a son of the king, in this case a son of God. A God being, in other words. There's a God over Persia, there's a God over Greece. And like I said last week, my surmise is, I think it's reasonable, there's probably gods over all territories, all nations, not just Persia and Greece, and that's it. Persia and Greece are named, but I think they're just examples. I surmise, my speculation, if you want, is that there are God beings, princes, archons over all nations, right? And I think we can see that in the case of Egypt, for example. If we turn back to Exodus 12, which I think we were here last week, Exodus 12, I think, is, again, quite helpful. Exodus 12 and 12. So God's talking, God is talking to Moses about what's about to come to pass, which is going to be the 10th of the 10 plagues, the death of the firstborn on the Passover night. So we pick up the story in 12:12. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, Passover night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and notice, against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am Jehovah. I am the God. No other gods beside me. Certainly not these characters in Egypt. And it says there, against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. We saw last week, the 10 plagues appear to be focused, each one on a god of Egypt. The Nile god, the frog god, the god of the cattle, the god of the sun, Ra, the sun god, the darkness and so on. So it wasn't just 10 random plagues willy-nilly. The plagues were addressed against each god in Egypt, so that the God was, in a sense, opposing and defeating and humiliating the gods of Egypt that the Egyptians worshipped. And like I said last week, God gets no praise for defeating imaginations in the Egyptians' minds. If they only imagined these gods and put a little wooden idol or a little stone idol, and that's their God, God gets no benefit, no praise, no reverence, no veneration from defeating a piece of rock, right? But if there's real gods, spirit beings in Egypt, many of them, there's at least 10, and I suspect probably more than that, then God gets reverence because he defeats them all. Even 10 of them can't hold back the God of gods, right? So the King of Kings, the Lord, right, God Jehovah, defeats all the gods of Egypt. So Egypt, the territory, the nation, has gods, in this case, clearly plural. That might apply to all nations. It mentions the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, but that might be the top dog in Greece and Persia. It could well be there's multiple gods per nation, because there certainly appear to be multiple gods here in the land of Egypt. And it looks to me that the God assigned the other gods to the nations back in the days of the Tower of Babel. We were there again last week, right? And although we sort of tend to gloss over the Tower of Babel story, a lot of people never turn to it, perhaps never think about it. But I think many scholars say that of the 3 major rebellions against God, each of which had major repercussions on the earth, the Garden of Eden incident, listening to the serpent, rebelling against God and his word, that had huge repercussions for the earth. There's another one a bit later we might turn to in a week or two's time. And the third one was the Tower of Babel. We might think, nothing to it. The nations gather together, God says, scatter around the earth and replenish it and fill it and so on. And no, we're not going to do that. We're going to cluster together here in Babel. We're going to build ourselves a tower, probably with a temple on it, and worship a God, the God from our temple. And God says, not having that. Comes down and has a look. And of course, you remember the language, let us go down and see what they're up to. Like I said last week, it's quite likely that the us is the divine council. So the God Jehovah is saying to the divine council, to the princes and his sons, let's go down and check out what they're doing. Doesn't like it, confounds the languages, spreads them around the earth, and that's when the nations are separated. And it's at that time it seems that God appointed to each nation a god, a prince, because at that stage, mankind as a whole had rejected God. So now God rejects them and essentially disinherits them. You don't want me? Fine, I don't want you. Off you go. Oh, by the way, here's a God to look after you. Not me, but them. This son of God, this prince, this archon will look after you. Or not, as the case may be. If we look at Deuteronomy 32, we can see the description of this event. When God separated the nations. Deuteronomy 32, I'm going to read verses 8 and 9. We'll start at verse 7, I think. This is Moses talking to the people. They're about to go into the promised land. You know, at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses dies, and the people go across the Jordan into the promised land, following Joshua as their new leader. So this is just before they enter the promised land, which is Jehovah's land. Jehovah has reserved the land of Israel, Canaan, to his people, right? And they're about to go across, which will be his land. All around there are other nations, Assyria, Babylon, Lebanon, Egypt, and so on and so forth, other nations with other gods. But here we are, verse 7. Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations, ask your father, he will show you, your elders, they will tell you, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations. He divided out a portion of the land to various nations. Those of you from Assyria are going over there. Those of you from Lebanon are going over there. Those of you from Sudan are going over there. Those of you from Libya are going over there. So when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, and that was at the Tower of Babel, he set the boundaries of the peoples, their borders, in other words, the territory that they would occupy, according to the number of the children of Israel. At least that's what my New King James Version says. It's probably what your Bible says. That's the majority of Bibles translate, that God separated the nations, apportioned out the earth to them in accordance with the number of the children of Israel. But that's not the only translation that's possible. For example, the ESV, English Standard Version, the RSV, Revised Standard Version, they translate this verse here, when the Most High divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. In other words, the princes, God's sons, the gods with a small g. So that every nation, God gave them a god, a prince, a watcher, an archon over each nation. And he did that at the Tower of Babel. So he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. Or the Net translation, which is a New English translation, translates it as, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the heavenly assembly. Again, heavenly beings. So the land, the earth being apportioned out to peoples, and to each of which was given a heavenly being, a son of God, a prince, or the Message. Not really a translation in some ways, it's more of a paraphrase, but I think the language is quite interesting and probably quite helpful. So the Message translation, when the high God gave the nations their stake, he gave them their place on earth. He put each of the peoples within boundaries under the care of divine guardians. So that's consistent. The nations are parceled out around the world, and to each nation is given a divine guardian, a son of God, a prince, an archon, and they will be subjects of that particular God being, right? Now, most Bibles do what's here in the New King James, that they are split, divided according to the number of the children of Israel. It's not so much a translation issue, this, I don't want to get too technical, but essentially you've got old manuscripts, and the very oldest manuscripts that they've got access to are what are referred to as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are physically copied way back in 100 to 200 BC. They were found in the area of Qumran near the Dead Sea, hence they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls.
We've seen them, yeah.
Yeah, we went down there on a coach trip at the Feast of Tabernacles one time, just like the lunar landscape. There's all these mountains and caves in them, and in the caves you found these clay pots. In the clay pots were largely dried out manuscripts,
Isaiah 55,
including Deuteronomy and so on. And in the ancient copies of the Deuteronomy script, you've got sons of God, right? So that's the oldest, and many scholars think it's therefore the most accurate. It's later copies that came hundreds of years later that refer to sons of Israel, and a lot of scholars are, I think that's been adapted somewhere along the line by nefarious copyists. So, plus on top of that, if you think about the internal evidence, if you like, the Tower of Babel, what Israel? God divided the nations of the Tower of Babel according to the sons of Israel when there weren't any. There wasn't any Israel at that time. The Israelites heading up towards the Promised Land, their territory, that was nearly 1,000 years later after the Tower of Babel, at least 850 years, I think. So it doesn't make a lot of sense logically to say that God divided the nations of the Tower of Babel according to the sons of Israel when there wasn't any Israel. No Abraham, no Isaac, no Jacob, no people of Israel. For nearly not far off 1,000 years going to pass. So it doesn't make a lot of logical sense. And as I say, the most ancient manuscripts you can find, the Dead Sea Scrolls, say sons of Israel. Sons of God, I should say. Yet, when God allocated the nations to their boundaries, their borders, their territories, and appointed a son of God, a prince, one of his sons over them, he kept Israel, the future Israel, to himself. We can see that in verse 9. So we're still in Deuteronomy 32 and verse 9. So he talks about dividing the nations according to the sons of God. Verse 9, for the Lord's portion, Jehovah's portion, is his people. Jacob is the place of his inheritance. God's kept back Israel for himself. They are his inheritance, and they'll inherit the place he gives to them. He's preserving the land of Canaan for his people. Right? Jacob is the place of his inheritance. So the other nations have got other gods, but Israel, Jacob, they're Jehovah's people, and they're living in Jehovah's territory, Jehovah's place. Right? You can see that also in Deuteronomy 4, if we turn back there. Deuteronomy in chapter 4. I'm going to read verses 19 and 20, but at the top of my page here, it's got the heading for this passage as beware of idolatry. In other words, don't worship, don't be loyal to, don't give your allegiance to other gods. So, that pretty much tells you there are other gods. It's not just in your imagination you're going to worship a sort of lump of stone, right, carved into the shape of a woman or something. This is other gods who are beings, and you better not show your loyalty to other beings if you're Jehovah's inheritance, if you're Jehovah's possession. He's your God, not others. So pick up the verses 19 and 20. So Moses says, take heed, lest you lift your eyes to heaven when you see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host of heaven, that would include spirit beings in heaven, as you see later, you feel driven to worship them and serve them, which the Lord your God has given to all the peoples under the whole heaven as a heritage. So God's given them. The God, capital G, has given the nations, the peoples under heaven, other gods, sun, moon, stars, the host of heaven, the princes, the archons are given to other nations. That's for them, not for you. But the Lord has taken you, Israel, and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be his people, an inheritance as you are this day. You are God's inheritance. You better be loyal to Jehovah God, because you are his inheritance. This is the land he gave you. These are the borders he drew for you. Don't look to other gods over the other nations, because that's different. Other nations have got different gods, not Jehovah. All right? And we can see that also if we turn to Deuteronomy 17. If you think about it, you've probably noticed when you're reading through the Bible that the Bible's about Israel, about Jehovah and people of Israel, God's inheritance. There's very little reference to other nations other than where they occasionally interact with Israel, Egypt, perhaps Syria, perhaps Babylon later. So you've got reference to Israel and its story, its people, its kings, and so on and so forth, its prosperity, its battles. You've got a little bit of reference to nearby nations in the periods when they interact, but most of the people on the earth, China, Japan, Central and South America, there's nothing in the Bible about these people. Why not? Because the Bible is a story of Jehovah and his inheritance, Jacob, and other nations only so far as typically they interact, war and conflict. But most of the Bible is just Israel, God's inheritance, not the rest of the world, because they have other gods. Although ultimately God will bring them all back to him. Like God said to Abraham when he started dealing with Abraham, in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed through your seed, Jesus Christ. So all the nations ultimately will be brought back from the failed gods to the God, Jehovah. But that's still underway. So Deuteronomy 17, I think we got there. I'm going to read verses 2 through 5. And if there is found among you, with any of your gates, which the Lord your God gives you, a man or woman who has been wicked in the sight of Jehovah your God, in transgressing his covenant, who has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, either the sun or moon or any of the host of heaven, which includes spirit beings, which I have not commanded, and it is told you, and you hear of it, then you shall inquire diligently, and if it is indeed true and certain that such an abomination has been committed in Israel, then you shall bring out to your gates that man or woman who has committed that wicked thing, and shall stone to death that man or woman with stones. Right? So anybody who worships the sun, the moon, the stars, the host of heaven, any other god, is to be stoned to death, because you are Jehovah's possession. You are Jehovah's inheritance. Other nations have got gods, right? But you are Jehovah's. You better not turn your eyes to these other god beings, these other princes, these other archons. Nothing to do with you. That's that nation's God. You've got Jehovah as your God, and he's the one to whom you must be loyal, to whom your allegiance must be given. You must be faithful to Jehovah God, right? And it's a death penalty if you don't. So God takes it fairly seriously. And of course, we see the state of the other gods. God condemned them all. Psalms 82. You're all going to die because you're hopeless, right? You don't really want to be coming under any other god but the true God. If you turn to Acts chapter 17, see Paul's reference. So Acts in chapter 17. I'm going to read verses 22 to 27. So Paul's on his wanderings, and he's arrived in Athens, the capital of Greece. Been there for a few weeks, I guess. Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. A fairly courteous start to his public address to them. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you, God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, such as the Parthenon and so on, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. And he is made from one blood, I guess looking back towards, Adam, Eve, and so on. He is made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. So that's confirming what we just read. God set out the nations according to certain borders. God established the boundaries of Greece and Persia and Egypt and Israel. God set out the boundaries, the borders. So it says there, verse 26, he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and God has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. Not quite sure what pre-appointed times are, other than it's possible that God's setting up nations for certain periods of prosperity and success and being superior to other nations, and then God has set in place days when they're going to fade away, probably depending on how they respond to what's good and what's bad. But he's also set the boundaries of their dwellings, because that's how God allocated the world, to certain peoples in accordance with the princes or the sons of God. So that, verse 27, that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. Ultimately, all mankind will come back to God, right? That's what God has in mind ultimately, but not in the short term. From the days of Paul, God was setting his hand to go out and start to invite the nations to come back to him. Not prior to that in any significant way, but with Paul, very different. Paul, as we know, was the apostle to the Gentiles. Gentiles is the nations, all right? So Paul is the apostle to the Gentile nations. That's his job, that's his mission. That's why God called him. And then Paul went out to the nations, to Greece and to Rome ultimately, and to other places, Asia Minor. And Paul went out to invite them to leave their regional, national gods and to return voluntarily to Jehovah God. That was Paul's message. That was Paul's mission. He went out, to Galatia, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamos, all various places, to Rome. And Paul went there and said, hey, guys and gals, you need to drop your God over this area. You need to come to Jehovah, the true God, the Most High God, the real God. He's the one you should come to. Change your allegiance from this God, Diana, Aphrodite, Zeus, Jupiter, whatever. Come to the true God. That's what Paul was doing. And of course, you can see that Paul met opposition wherever he went. And it wasn't just human opposition, it was spiritual opposition, because Paul's going into the territory, the region that is subject to these gods. And of course, the gods are not willing to accept that. Who's this imposter coming into my territory of which I'm the God? And he's trying to convince my people to leave me and to go to Jehovah, not having that. So, the gods stirred up, hostility towards Paul. He was run out of almost everywhere he went. Beaten up, scourged, right? Beaten with rods, thrown out, under the bus, all the rest of it, because the gods were unhappy. The gods are angry with Paul coming in and inviting the people, their subjects, to leave them, right? And when Paul writes to the believers, he uses language commensurate with God beings, princes, and so on. We can see that if we turn, first of all, to Ephesians chapter 1. I think there's 3 places in Ephesians we can look, but we'll start in chapter 1. Just look at Paul's language and then think about what he's meaning. So start in verses 20 to 21. Unfortunately, this is one of Paul's exceedingly long sentences. It's on forever and ever. So with apologies to Paul, I'm sort of cutting into the middle of quite a long sentence, but I think you get the point. He's talking about God's power, verse 20, which God worked in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated Jesus at his right hand in the heavenly places, what we're talking about, far above all principality and power and might and dominion and every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in that which is to come. So Jesus Christ has been raised up to sit at God's right hand, far above. Then it mentions 4 ranks of spirit being. Jesus is far above, just like God Jehovah is far above. These other beings are nowhere near. You know, God stands alone in terms of superiority and magnificence and so on and so forth, right? So the small g gods are not God's equal. They're not in the same power in the slightest, but they are gods, right? Not to be worshipped, but they are gods who will be punished by God fairly soon, I think. So it says here that he raised Jesus to his right hand, verse 21, far above all principality and power and might and dominion. That's 4 ranks, right? Now the word principality there is archon, which of course you associate with Daniel chapter 10. The archon of Persia, the archon of Greece. And Paul talks here to the brethren about Jesus is far above all principality and power and the might and dominion and so on. And the word principality includes within it a reference to a geography or a territory, right? In fact, scholars believe that all of those titles there, principality, power, might, dominion, are all referring to geographically located beings. Like a principality, we've got some today. You've got the Principality of Monaco in Europe and France. There's the Principality of Liechtenstein. It's not a very common term these days, but principality is a state governed by a prince. That's what principality is. So principality, the word principality includes within it reference to a territory, a geography somewhere with a spirit being over it, an archon, right? So all of those 4 ranks mentioned there, a principality, a power, a might, a dominion, all seem to refer. Dominion, for example, it's a kingdom. Dominion, it's a kingdom, it's a state, it's a place, it's a geography. And all of these, so back in Deuteronomy 32, that God allocated peoples to various territories and put a spirit being over them, God being over them. Ephesians 3, let's read verses 10 to 11. Ephesians 3, again cutting into one of Paul's lengthy sentences, verse 10, to the intent that now the manifold wisdom of God might be made known by the church to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places, according to the eternal purpose which he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord. So the church is going to reveal to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. So it's not on the earth. The principalities are in the heavens, right? Or at least their rule is. The powers are in the heavens. These are spirit beings in God's heavens. Some other translations use the phrase rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. Rulers and authorities. Well, these aren't just vague terms. I mean, we might sort of gloss over them quickly when we're sort of reading to try and get through this chapter today and so on. But it's talking of rulers, spiritual authorities, spirit beings who have power, who have authority, who have influence, who can make a big impact on situations. They are principalities, they are powers, they are rulers, they are authorities, they are dominions. But they're not just clouds floating around. They're actual beings with actual minds, with experience, with agendas, right? And they are over the nations. Have a look at Ephesians chapter 6. Let's read verses 10 to 13. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armour of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles or the schemings of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, we might think we do, but against 4 more ranks. Against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts or armies of wickedness in the heavenly places. Where are they? In the heavenly places. The spirit beings, not just abstract clouds of whatever. These are actual beings, spirit beings, right? They're alive, they've got minds, they've got intellects, they've got agendas and plans. And they're working with the devil, this lot here at least. So many of them obviously on the dark side, right? Therefore, verse 13, take up the whole armour of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand. Because we're in a battle. It's a spirit battle against spirit beings, right? And we're up against them. The ESV translates this verse in slightly different language. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, cosmic powers over this present darkness, and the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And again, as I said before, these appear to be linked to territories or regions, regional terms, right? So these are spirit beings who are over, at least at some point in time, over nations, over their territories. And today, we could wonder what particular gods or sons of gods or archon or princes are over modern nations. Which gods, sons of God, are over Iraq today, or Libya today, right? Or France today, or Britain today, or the USA today.
I can tell you the one from
Right?
Britain.
Or Venezuela today. Who are these gods and what are they up to today?
I know what it
Right.
is up to.
And I think if we can see that these God beings, these sons of God, these princes or archons, are regionally oriented, or sort of generally speaking seem to be based in a particular region or territory, that might explain a couple of otherwise rather peculiar passages that we might come across.
Curious.
Right, so we'll have a look at a couple of them. And we'll start in 2 Kings chapter 5. So if you find 2 Kings, which comes after 1 Kings, if that's any help to you. So 2 Kings in chapter 5.
Number, love.
So 2 Kings 5, verse 1. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honourable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valour, but a leper. Problem. So great warrior, highly regarded by the king of Syria, but he's a leper. So the story goes on that a young maiden in the house of the king says that why doesn't your servant go to Israel, where there's a prophet who can heal him of his leprosy? But, oh, that's exciting. So the king sends Naaman to Jerusalem to visit the king and ask to be healed. And of course the king freaks out. The king of Israel freaks out, thinking, it's been provocative. I can't heal a leper. What's that all about? Right? So we cut into the story at that point, verse 8 to 14. So it was when Elisha, who was the prophet, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, because he thought this was an insult from king of Syria, deliberately being provocative, trying to start a war, whatever it might be, that he, Elisha, sent to the king saying, why have you torn your clothes? Please let him, Naaman, come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Elisha comes along and says, send him to me, I'll deal with this, Mr. King of Israel. And so Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, you shall be clean. But Naaman became furious, and went away and said, indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me, and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place, and heal the leprosy. Because it's not working out. Naaman's got a view in his mind. I'm Naaman, the mighty warrior. I'm outside the door of the prophet's house. He's going to come out at least, and welcome me. He's going to maybe wave his magic wand and cure me. And all he says is go and wash 7 times in the river Jordan. I'm not happy with that, right? And then he carries on, verse 12. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, his home territory, better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage, bad-tempered. And his servants came near and spoke to him and said, my father, if the prophet told you to do something great, would you not have done it? If he said, go off and get 5 unicorn horns from the middle of Africa, you'd have gone off and found them, brought them back, something mighty and great, a great adventure, a great challenge, you'd have done it. Clean the Augean stables or something, you'd have done it. But he just says, go and wash when you're refusing to do it. Come on, think about this. How much more then when he says to you, wash and be clean? So he listens, fair enough, to Naaman. He's a proud man, no doubt, but he thinks, I see what you're saying. Yeah, okay, fair enough. So he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Marvellous. He must have been over the moon, because he's all these boils and skin problems and scars and who knows what not. The leprosy of those days might have looked like, but now he's washed 7 times, not twice, not 3 times, and I guess you go down once and you come back up and it looks the same twice, looks the same 3 times, nothing's happening here, I'm wasting my time. 6 times, absolutely nothing. Why bother? 7 times, okay, I'll do it 7 times. Goes down and comes up and my flesh is like it was when I was 10 years old. Oh my word. So he's delighted and most impressive. No doubt his servants were also pretty impressed by what had just taken place before them. Verse 15 through 17. And he returned to the man of God, he and all his aides, all of them no doubt utterly impressed, came and stood before Elisha, and he said, indeed now I know there is no God on all the earth except in Israel. It doesn't mean no God, he means no God like this God, because he's got his own gods. He's from Syria, their God is Rimmon, right? So he's familiar with his God, but his God can't cure leprosy. The God of Israel, wow, now we're talking of gods. Now therefore, please take a gift from your servant. And I think he had gold and silver and robes and whatnot. But Elisha said, as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive nothing. And he urged him to take it, but Elisha refused. Not only for the money. Don't give me any gifts. Don't want them. Glad you're healed. Wonderful to see. Like the look of your flesh. Off you go now. So Naaman said, then if not, please let your... This is a part I want to get at. This sort of like, what's this all about? This can't make any sense. So Naaman said, then if not, please let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth. What? Let me take 2 loads of soil from your back garden? What's this all about? For your servant will no longer offer either burnt offering or sacrifice to other gods, but to Jehovah only. So if you think about it, this is the point of the story in a sense, is that Naaman knows or believes that the gods are territorial. And this is the territory of Jehovah, who's the God that's healed him. And what Naaman wants to do is to continue to worship and praise Jehovah God. But when he goes back to Syria, that's not Jehovah's inheritance. That's not Israel. When he goes back to Syria, that's the territory of Rimmon, who's the main god of Syria, if you're at the top of that. And he's just thinking, it's a predicament. I'm going to be back in the territory of Rimmon. How can I worship Jehovah properly in a different territory? Because Jehovah is the God of Israel, this territory. This is Jehovah's inheritance. So what he's asking for here is 2 mule loads of earth that I can take back to Syria. Now, I don't know what he's going to do with them when he gets there, right? They might spread them in the ground, right? With soil over perhaps his back garden. And he wants to praise Jehovah God. He's going to go out perhaps and kneel on that soil because it's Israel soil. And therefore he can better worship the God of Israel on the soil of Israel. Or maybe you're going to build a little altar with that soil. You can have a soil, an earthen altar, that's in Scripture. So maybe you're going to make a little altar of earth of Israel and use that to better worship Jehovah God. But what he seems to be thinking to himself is, I need Jehovah's territory to worship Jehovah, right? I can't do it on Syrian soil because that's not Jehovah's. Syrian soil is Rimmon's territory. So that looks like that's what's behind his thinking, right? And you get a similar instance, perhaps a little bit more difficult to see, but I think it's the same story in King David's life. If we turn to 1 Samuel and chapter 26, that comes before Kings. First Samuel comes before Second Samuel, if that helps. And 26.
You've been very helpful today,
Page 397, if you've got the same Bible as me. So the story here, the background is that David's on the run. Right, Saul's after him. Saul knows he's going to be replaced by King David, so ideally he wants to kill King David and then he won't be replaced by him. So David's on the run out in the wilderness, and Saul and his armies are busy chasing around to try and track down David and do him in. Right, so this particular night, Saul and his army have encamped. They're all asleep, and David's nearby, finds out about the camp, and he sneaks in under cover of darkness, and he finds where Saul's sleeping with his bodyguard, and he steals Saul's spear, which is stuck in the ground nearby Saul's bed, and also Saul's water jug that I guess he keeps water in for, gets thirsty in the night, and then it disappears again. And then David, when he's far enough away, starts shouting to wake them all up and said, "Hey, what happened there then? What happened to you, Mr. Bodyguard?" So we'll pick up the story in verse 15, 1 Samuel 26 and verse 15. So David said to Abner, but I imagine he's got to shout across the valley or whatever. So David said to Abner, who was the king's bodyguard, "Are you not a man? And who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not guarded your lord the king?" Mr. Bodyguard, "For one of the people came in to destroy your lord the king." I think David's assistant was minded to do that. "This thing that you've done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, Abner, because you have not guarded your master, the Lord's anointed." I mean, David was always very respectful about Saul because he said Jehovah anointed him, so I can do nothing against the Lord's anointed. David would not lift a hand against King Saul, even though he had several opportunities like this one here. But God anointed him. It's really for God to sort of unanoint him, not for me. "And now see, or have a look, where the king's spear is, and the jug of water that was by his head. Can you find it, Abner, matey?" And of course they look at him, "Oh, spear's gone. Oh, jug of water's gone. Oh, obviously David's been here. He could have lifted his sword up and chopped your head off." King Saul. Then Saul knew or recognized David's voice and said, "Is that your voice, my son David?" David said, "It is my voice, my lord, O king." And he said, "Why does my lord thus pursue his servant? For what have I done? What evil is in my hand?" Absolutely none, of course. David was completely loyal, as this example shows, to King Saul. "Now therefore, please, let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If the Lord has stirred you up against me, let him accept an offering." Let God accept an offering, "But if the children of men, may they be cursed before the Lord. For why? They have driven me out this day from sharing in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, 'Go, serve other gods.'" So David's lamenting here because he's been driven out of God's inheritance. What's God's inheritance? The promised land. That's the land over which Jehovah is the God. It's his inheritance. And it says there, "I've been driven out of the inheritance of Jehovah." And he said to me, "Go serve other gods." You go into another territory. Find other gods to serve when you get there. The gods of Moab, the gods of Edom, the gods of Syria, whatever it might be. Get out of the Lord's, and David's upset, right? So now, verse 20, "Do not let my blood fall to the earth before the face of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a flea, as when one hunts a partridge in the mountains." Then Saul said, "I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will harm you no more, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Indeed, I have played the fool and erred exceedingly." And he had played the fool, but that was his vanity. And, God rejected Saul because he was just rebellious. But you can see the problem there is that to David, he's got to lament. He probably knows in his heart that God's power extends everywhere, but he's uneasy. He doesn't seem to believe he can worship Jehovah God properly in some other God's territory. He believes he needs to be in Israel, the land of Israel, in the promised land, to worship Jehovah God properly and faithfully and so on. When he's outside of the borders of the land, he's outside of God's inheritance. I can't praise God properly here. It's the wrong place. It's wrong. A bit like Naaman. I can't praise Jehovah God here in Syria and Damascus because it's different God's territory. But thankfully, I've got a couple of mule loads of earth in my back garden. I've spread them out, and I can kneel down there and in my mind worship Jehovah God on some of God's territory, which I've brought with me, right? And David is the same story, because likewise, David is clearly uneasy. I've been driven from the Lord's inheritance and been told to go worship other gods, the ones over some other territory. I don't want to do that. I'm David. I'm going to be faithful to Jehovah God, but to be properly faithful, to worship him properly in a way that's going to please him, is I need to be in his territory. Let me back in, Saul, into Israel, where I can praise Jehovah God with a pure heart, fervently, and so on. So I think that's the story that's happening there. So we've seen, that the gods are real. They appear to be over various different nations. We've seen them over Persia, over Greece, or Javan, the Hebrew. Nowadays that would be Asia Minor. Over Egypt, at least 10 gods, but I suspect many more gods. In fact, although you refer to a god over each nation, by the looks of it, there might be one main god over each nation, but by the sound of it, there are other secondary gods over the nations as well, right? And most likely over our nations today. I don't see why they would have gone away, and of course many of the gods, sons of God over the nations, are corrupt and dangerous. We saw that in Psalms 82, remember? God says, not happy, you're corrupt, you've not been faithful, you've not looked after your subjects, the people of your territories to whom I allocated you, and it's not good enough. And of course that might explain, I think, some of the problems that we see today. If you look around your nation today, I look around my nation today, a lot of bad things.
I don't want to hear.
It's like, spiritually dark countries. Evil, immorality, fraud, abuse, violence, crime. I mean, the story. I imagine it's similar wherever you might be. You think, well, is that just human beings? I mean, I'm sure in part, human nature, right? The fall, Garden of Eden, all the rest of it. I'm sure a lot of our troubles are from human beings being human beings, but you do wonder whether, the gods over our nations, the old gods, whatever you want to call them, are also having a spiritual effect in our nations, so that our problems are not just human problems, but they are very spiritual in nature. And you'll often hear a lot of very senior people out there, podcasters, people like Candace Owens, you might know her name. Yep. Tucker Carlson, you might know his name. Charlie Kirk, you probably know his name. And these people have said for years now that the problems in our nations are spiritual in nature. Yeah. Now, they're not using the word God beings over our nations, because they might be thinking of, the God, Jehovah God, but other gods over our nations can be causing great problems by keeping our peoples, distracted by and under their influence, which is a dark, evil influence, a spirit influence. And of course, you're not going to fight that by spending more tax money on education, spending more tax money on prisons. It's not the problem. The problem is a spiritual problem of spiritually evil beings who are influencing our nations. That's where I think we might be going next week when I get around to it. Okay, but that's us for today, so we'll leave it there.